welcome everybody to another episode of This Month in Rock History. I, of course, am your host, Larry Roberts, and we're here to recap all of the different historical events, releases, things that we discussed from the month of July. Now, we're not talking about current month of July. We're looking back at things that came out years ago, especially the stuff that appeals to people like me, Gen Xers and such that were into the music of the 1970s, the 1980s, and so on. Now, if these longer form videos are not to your liking, don't worry, because we put out shorts every week that feature these segments in there where we talk about all sorts of cool stuff. It could be pop, it could be rock, heavy metal, all the different types of music that we grew up loving and enjoying. And you can check out those shorts here on YouTube or over on TikTok and Instagram. And while you're at it, if you like what you're seeing and hearing here today, please hit the like button and hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified when these shorts come out every week and when we do other content like what you're watching right now. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So starting things off, we continued on with the thing we started up last month, which was looking at Billboard chart listings from previous years. Got a lot of great response and great feedback from you all out there, so thank you so much for your feedback. We are going to keep doing more of the flashbacks of the Billboard charts because you all requested it. And coming up first here, we have the Billboard Top 10 Singles Chart, 1982. It's hard to believe that was 42 years ago, but check out some of these classic songs that made it to the top 10.
Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love. Heavenly, heavenly, living in perfect harmony. Love's been a little, it's been a little. Love's been a little bit hard on me. Let's whip it, baby. Let's whip it right. Let's whip it, baby. It's the eye of the tiger, it's the thrill of the fight, rising up. 'Cause it's the heat of the moment, heat of the moment. Come on, baby, it's so good. Waking in the morning, see you rise, Rosanna. Don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me?
Yep, like I said, a lot of those songs, if not maybe all of them, are considered classics, staples of classic radio now. Whether you're listening on Sirius or you're listening to the local classic rock station or whatever you have in your area, many of these songs, again, probably all of them, are played all the time, and I love a lot of these songs. Heat of the Moment by Asia is a great one. Caught Up in You by 38 Special. But judging by the feedback I got from you, it seems like a lot of you out there remember these songs fondly too. So moving on, talking about another absolute classic that still gets tons of airplay and respect today. We're looking at an album that was released 43 years ago. We're talking July 1981. Now, this was a release for a band that had already really skyrocketed to stardom. Their previous albums to this one had done very, very well, but it was this album that really catapulted them into superstardom. And with this, they were headlining arenas all over the world. Man, they even had their own video game that came out for the Atari at the time. What album am I talking about? I'm talking about Escape from Journey.
This week in rock history, we focus on one of the biggest releases for the rock band Journey, none other than the Escape album. Released in July of 1981, Escape was the first album to feature new keyboardist Jonathan Cain, who brought with him some major songwriting chops that combined well with vocalist Steve Perry and guitarist Neil Schon. Together they created timeless hits like Who's Crying Now, Open Arms, and Don't Stop Believing. Those singles and the album wound up being a hit both critically and with fans, with Escape ultimately becoming a diamond certified record with well over 10 million copies sold. Even today, Escape regularly ranks highly on greatest album lists. And while they have had some lineup changes over the years, Journey still thrills audiences around the world playing many of their hits from this album.
Oh man, I just love Escape. I remember getting that album that year. I didn't get my copy until Christmas, unfortunately. Back in the days when you were a kid, you had to wait for those precious opportunities to get all your records or toys or whatever you were asking for. And I just listened to that album non-stop. So many of the songs on that album: Don't Stop Believin', Still They Ride, Stone in Love, Who's Crying Now, Open Arms, all of those songs became huge staples of the radio and songs that they still play in concert. I mean, they have to play those songs in concert. People would riot if they didn't. So yeah, that album, it goes without saying, is a massive one. All right, so that album may have taken Journey up into the heavens and escalated them sky high, but this next album we're talking about is going in the opposite direction. Not because it's not popular, but because of the subject matter and the style. We're going to look at a release that came out from the band Slayer in July 1988, and I'm talking about South of Heaven.
This week in rock history, we look back at a classic yet slightly controversial release from the band Slayer, their fourth studio album, South of Heaven. Released in July 1988, Slayer felt that they just couldn't top the speed and aggression of their previous album, Rain and Blood. So they made a conscious decision to slow down the tempo on most of the material and create a sound that was darker and even a little bit more melodic. As such, this wound up making it a controversial release for some fans who felt that Slayer was losing some of its edge. And this was reflected in the opinions of the band members Kerry King and Dave Lombardo, who stated that they too felt the band wasn't quite firing on all cylinders. But songs like Mandatory Suicide, Silent Scream, and the title track remain absolute classics. And many fans nowadays consider South of Heaven to be a great album in the Slayer catalog.
Yeah, so I was a Slayer fan at the time when this album came out. I was all invested in that. I was in high school. Me and my friends loved Slayer, and we loved Rain and Blood. It was pretty much, and it still is today, considered one of the top-tier extreme metal albums. And when we heard South of Heaven, it was a little bit different. It was a big change for the band in a lot of ways. You let me know. How did you feel about South of Heaven if you were a Slayer fan? Did it not bother you that they slowed down and they changed a little bit? Or did it change things for you and how you felt about Slayer after that? So leave a comment below. Well, speaking of heavy extreme bands that changed the music world, we're going to go back to the debut release of possibly the biggest metal band of all time. They put this album out back in July of 1983. Can you believe that, folks? 41 years ago, we got the debut from the Bay Area speed metal masters of their time. Who am I talking about? I'm talking, of course, about Metallica and their debut album, Kill 'Em All.
This week in rock history, we highlight the debut release from possibly the biggest metal band of all time, none other than Metallica's Kill 'Em All. Released in July of 1983, Kill 'Em All contains songs that the band had worked on during their West Coast shows the previous few years, most of which were featured on their classic Metal Up Your Ass demo, which got them noticed by Johnny Z and his brand new record label Megaforce. Guitarist Dave Mustaine was let go from the band before recording would start, with Exodus guitarist Kirk Hammett taking over the lead guitar role. Songs like Whiplash, Motor Breath, and Phantom Lord showed that the band was something to be taken seriously. And Cliff Burton's Anesthesia Pulling Teeth was a masterwork of bass technique. Kill 'Em All laid the groundwork for the speed and thrash metal sound that would come to dominate the 80s metal underground.
So I think it goes without saying that Metallica and Kill 'Em All really changed music. I realized that Kill 'Em All had a lot of very obvious influences. People love to talk about it nowadays, about how they had so much really obvious influence from the new wave of British heavy metal and Motorhead and a lot of other things that you could very obviously see there. But I think the way Metallica melded it all together and what they put out there and the way they played, their image, everything, it changed the game. And I don't think that metal, or it's not just 80s metal, but metal even going till today, I don't think it would be anything like what we see now had Metallica not come along. And it all started with Kill 'Em All. So you got to give that album its props. All right, we're going to move it forward a little bit, just barely getting into the 1990s with a very important album that came out for a band. Even though this was not their debut album, a lot of people kind of consider it a debut album because the previous albums they had done before this one were so incredibly different, it almost felt like a different band. And most people, at least most people I know, truly discovered this band when they put this one out in July of 1990. And while this is actually their 5th full-length album, for all practical purposes, it was a whole new beginning for this band. And wow, where they went after this is pretty remarkable. What am I talking about? If you haven't guessed already, I'm talking about Cowboys from Hell by the band Pantera.
This week in rock history, we celebrate the 34th anniversary of the breakthrough album from the band Pantera, none other than Cowboys from Hell. Released July 24th, 1990, this album was actually the 5th full-length from the band, with their previous albums featuring a more commercial hard rock kind of sound. But when they added vocalist Phil Anselmo for their 4th album, Power Metal, the band started to shift towards a more aggressive sound. And with the precise and complex drumming of Vinnie Paul and guitar mastery of Dimebag, then known as Diamond Darrell, Cowboys from Hell created a sound that was somehow both heavy as well as melodic and memorable, which helped them capture a wider fan base than many of the other heavy bands from that time. And even now, the sound and style that they forged with this album can be heard as an influence on many young bands today.
Yeah, Pantera is another one of those controversial bands for a lot of metal and hard rock fans. You know, some people love them. Some people say they can't stand them. Some people don't like where metal went in the 1990s when they added more of that groove and that whole style that Pantera brought to the table. But you have to give it credit because they have obviously influenced a ton of different artists out there. I mean, when we even see Madonna playing Pantera riffs on stage at one point, if you haven't seen that, look it up on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. Obviously, this is a band that had far-reaching influence, and for a lot of people and in a lot of ways, especially here in the United States, Pantera helped keep things alive during the whole 90s grunge and alternative and hip-hop and all that stuff. Pantera still, they were kicking through that whole thing, so I give them a lot of respect. Now, speaking of bands like Metallica and Pantera, here's a heavy band that was nowhere near as aggressive or extreme as those bands, but you have to admit that a band like this gave all of those bands and so many others loads of inspiration. And even though this band basically wrote a lot of songs that had 3 or 4 chords only in it, the way they did it and their swagger is legendary now, and people still love this band. And this next album, man, this was the one that really, really made its mark here in North America especially, but all over the world it was felt, and it still is. What am I talking about? I'm talking about my man Angus Young, Bon Scott, and the Highway to Hell album by AC/DC.
This week in rock history, we look at one of the all-time greats of classic hard rock, none other than AC/DC's Highway to Hell. Released in late July 1979, this album saw the band take a big step forward in several ways. Firstly, they enlisted producer Robert John Mutt Lange, who gave them a bigger and tighter production and helped them hone in on the best parts of their sound and playing. Songs like Girls Got Rhythm, Shot Down in Flames, and the title track went on to dominate the airwaves for decades to come and helped the album become 8 times platinum. Angus and Malcolm Young's guitar work truly shines, while Cliff and Phil's rhythm section is as solid as ever. Sadly, this album was the swan song for vocalist Bon Scott, who passed away in early 1980 and wouldn't live to see the true impact of his work in years to come.
Wow, man, that's an incredible album. And to think, again, that was 45 years ago. Sorry if I'm making all y'all feel old, because I certainly feel old, because I remember when that album came out, even though I was a kid. Even just the title track alone, Highway to Hell, you hear that everywhere you go. Sporting events, television, it's everywhere, and it's just an absolute classic. It's really sad that we didn't get more material from Bon Scott. He didn't get to live very long past it. I think if the album came out in July of 79, by February 1980, we lost Bon Scott. So it's crazy to think where things could have gone. But as far as AC/DC goes, they certainly soldiered on with that next album. They got Brian Johnson, they did Back in Black, and whoo, the sky was the limit for them. Moving on, we are going to look at yet another Billboard Top 10 Singles chart. This time we're going back to 1983. So yeah, we're talking 41 years ago. And we're looking at July 16th of 1983. So check out these absolute classics.
Out of my window, I could see them in the moonlight. Two silhouettes saying goodnight.
You wanna be starting something, you got to be starting something. I say you wanna be starting something. Never gonna let you go. I'm gonna hold you in my arms forever. Take your passion.
We gonna rock down to electric, and then we'll take it higher.
Smile, you afraid, claim you stay. I'll watch you.
All right, so those were the top 10 singles from July 16th, 1983. And it's interesting to note that, especially even compared to the one we saw earlier from the previous year of 1982, this was really the time of the second British invasion, so to speak, over here in the U.S., because a good number of those songs on that chart were from breakout British artists. You had Kajagoogoo, Duran Duran, Boy George and Culture Club, Madness with Our House. It's a great song. And then at the top of the charts, you had The Police, who, man, what an incredible band that was. Their work, they were gone way too fast, but their work still holds up today. And of course, you had your Michael Jackson, who was riding very high at the time, Irene Cara with Flashdance. Still a pretty cool mix of music in there, but yeah, it's just very interesting to see the contrast between this and simply one summer prior that still had bands like 38 Special and Journey and Survivor and more rock-oriented stuff. So you could see where things were starting to head in the 1980s, especially as far as mainstream radio airplay was going. And speaking of radio airplay, I'm going to give you a little bonus. This wasn't featured in any of our shorts that we released this past month, but since you sat through all this, I figure you deserve a little something extra. I'm always focusing on the top 10 albums or the top 10 singles charts, but how about looking at the top 10 rock tracks chart? Now, back in the 1980s and such, it was the charts that signaled not so much how much a record was selling, but how much a record was being played and added to playlists across the country. On various radio stations, whether they were mainstream or college stations, they would compile them into the top tracks chart list, and it was very different from what you would see from the regular top 10 pop singles chart. So here we go. We're going to count down the top 10 from July 25th, 1981. Coming in at number 10, we've got Fly Away by Southern Rockers Blackfoot. Number 9, Tempted by Squeeze. Get out your air drums, because at number 8, we have In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins. Number 7, it's Hard Rockers Blue Oyster Cult with Burning for You. Number 6, The Stroke by Billy Squier. Coming in at number 5, we had Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers with A Woman in Love. Number 4 is Fire and Ice by Pat Benatar. Number 3, A Life of Illusion by Joe Walsh. And number 2, one of my favorites, The Voice by the Moody Blues. And coming in at number 1 that week was none other than Foreigner with Urgent. So yeah, there you have it. That's the top rock tracks, the songs that were most added to radio charts July 25th, 1981. I love a lot of those songs, and a lot of times I really like the rock tracks better than the regular top 10 singles charts. So let me know what you think of that. What songs do you like out of that, and would you like to see me cover more of those rock charts? Because yeah, it's a little bit different. And you know what? With that, that is it for the month of July when we're talking about this month in rock history. Now, I already know there is a lot of rock history that occurred in the month of July that we didn't even get to. Unfortunately, we just don't have the time to cover all of it. But what I would love to know from you is, what stuff would you like to see us feature more? Were there certain artists, certain songs, certain albums, certain historical incidents that happened in music during the month of July that we completely glossed over that you feel like should have been highlighted? Let us know, leave a comment, make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe, because that's the only way you'll be notified when we have new content coming out. For those of you that watched or listened all the way to the end, thank you so much for joining us here. It's our pleasure to talk about this. We love talking about music, and we're going to have a lot more music content coming up in the near future. Again, I'm your host, Larry Roberts. I'll see you soon.